So, welcome to the first seminar of this new series. In case you don't know me, I should introduce myself as the director of the Aquinas Institute here, succeeding Fergus Kerr and Vivian Boland. I have a PhD in chemistry from the Superior University in the Far East. And after joining the order, I have done a mixture of pastoral and administrative and academic work, especially in dogmatic theology and the thought of St. Thomas Aquinas. We have two research institutes here at Blackfriars, the Aquinas Institute and the Las Casas Institute for Social Justice. And we are developing a joint research project on human nature and dignity, resources for the 21st century. So I'm working with Professor John Laughlin of the Las Casas Institute, and we are developing several interlocking strands of research, roughly divided between the two institutes. And the Las Casas Institute is holding a series of lectures all this academic year on human dignity, and this seminar series launches the Aquinas component, looking overall at Aquinas on nature and human nature, but focusing in this particular term on agency in human beings and other animals, the animal and the non-animal component of our human decision-making and things like that. And I've given you on the handout on page 1 a brief statement of our project. Does the conviction that each human being is a single being possessing a well-defined human nature and therefore distinctive forms of transcendence, dignity and responsibility remain intellectually respectable in the light of contemporary science? And it seems to me that St. Thomas is particularly useful and exciting in helping address that kind of question, because he holds that each animal is a single organism with a distinctive level of being and unity. He understands something of the complexity of the human psyche and its animal component, which is compatible with rationality and freedom and the immortality of the soul. So you might summarize his picture as embodied transcendence, or, to borrow a couple of modern phrases, the acting person is a dependent rational animal, or his definition of the human being as a rational animal implies we are intellectual in an animal way and animal in a rational way. The two parts of the definition, rational and animal, do not map onto two parts of us, but the whole of us is human, the whole is animal, and the whole is rational. Also, Aquinas is refreshingly pre-modern, before the train of thought got derailed by various bogies like Occam and Descartes. I shall only occasionally be that provocative. I've listed various issues that we have to investigate in this seminar series and in subsequent seminars and in workshops, eventually issuing in various publications. And today I want to give a kind of sketch of St. Thomas's picture of the human psyche, which will be a kind of context for this particular seminar and a context for the whole series. And the question I want to address eventually in this seminar is a human person a centre of consciousness, or a self-possessed, self-determining entity that's to be discovered within the whole complex system that is a living human being? Where is the person that is deciding to give you a seminar paper? Is it here, or in here in my heart, or in here in my head, or somewhere else? Well, of course, I'm in dialogue with various alternative positions, to none of which, except one perhaps, I will do any great justice. I'm reacting to a kind of caricature, Cartesian mechanism and dualism, where Descartes sees the animal and the human body as hydraulic machines, and he thinks the human being also contains a thinking subject, a thinking soul that uses the pineal gland in the middle of the head as a kind of steering column, like the soldier driving a tank. He thought that only human beings had a pineal gland, but in fact he was wrong. So Descartes' picture lies behind the modern surprise at discoveries that animals are conscious. Every now and then you see a newspaper headline, "Scientists have proved that animals are conscious." But we knew that in the 13th century. And there was a set of safe sex adverts on television, I think around the late 90s or the late 90s. And you saw clips of rhinoceroses copulating and swans kissing, and a Scottish voiceover said, "They don't make commitments, they don't have emotions, you're different." But of course some of them do make commitments, and they all do have emotions. We knew that in the 13th century. It shouldn't be a surprise. But we are different, and we need to put our finger, or make some attempt to put our finger on how. Of course, there are lots of modern, much more subtle versions of Cartesian mechanism. And certainly complexity theory goes some way towards getting some purchase on how certain properties can emerge from complexity. But it seems to me that it isn't the only way of looking at the human being, because while it will work for a kind of ecosystem, like perhaps a pond, where the fish and the frogs and the weeds and so on all cooperate so that something new emerges, it doesn't capture the way in which the human being is a single being. Of course, there are modern accounts, including Descartes' account, that focus very much on consciousness, or even better, self-consciousness, as a kind of diagnostic tool for determining that there is personhood with dignity and rights here. And there is a temptation to equate person with a centre of consciousness. And William Hill, who as a Dominican ought to have known better, wrote a book on the Trinity, in which he suggests that the Holy Trinity are three centres of consciousness, conscious by way of one essential consciousness. So the Father, the Son, and the Spirit are three centres of consciousness, three thinking and deciding subjects. And of course there is also a long tradition of finding a something in us that has a kind of intrinsic connection with God. A Salen Funklein or spark of the soul up there in my psyche, or something in the depth. And there's also a kind of post-Freudian suspicion that we put up masks to hide ourselves, to protect our real selves before the world. So the real me is hidden inside. I put up a kind of mask to hide myself from you. There were lots of alternative positions. And one of them is discussed by St. Bonaventure. So in a fit of ecumenism, I am going to make Dominican reparation to a traduced Franciscan. Because Serves Pankers, in his great book, The Sources of Christian Ethics, contrasts Aquinas' view of freedom with a kind of Ockhamist view, and he traces Ockham's view back to St. Bonaventure, and he quotes a position that St. Bonaventure presents, not noticing that St. Bonaventure presents it so as to refute it. On this issue, St. Bonaventure stands with St. Thomas, not over against him. There is a kind of high 13th century consensus, which I think breaks down in reaction to the 1277 condemnation of various theses. Before 1277, Thomas and Bonaventure conceive freedom as emerging from the components of human nature. And after 1277, someone like Scotus can contrast freedom and nature. So St. Bonaventure discusses a position which I've given a diagram for on page 2. In God, God the Father is the source of the Son who is wisdom and the Spirit who is love. And in the human psyche, there is a liberum arbitrium, a free decision-making power, which is over and above intellect and will. There's a something in us which is effectively an unmoved first mover, a spontaneous source of decision that decides how we shall think and what we shall love. And that might well adumbrate a kind of Ockhamist, voluntarist position in which the free will kind of floats above a landscape of choices, deciding arbitrarily, I'll have that one today, I'll have that one tomorrow. But St. Bonaventure rejects that position. Intellect and will, our powers to know and to love, have their own dynamics, and from their interplay emerges free decisions. A kind of caricature Ockhamist position where a power of free choice floats over a landscape of choices reminds me rather of that bit in The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, where a whale, I think, just pops into being in mid-air and starts thinking, I'm a whale, etc., till it plunges to Earth. And I think that myth lurks behind quite a lot of modern strands of thought and is not helpful. So on page 4 of the handout, I have given you a diagram of the Thomist view of the human psyche, and on page 3 and following some points about it. The first thing to warn you about is the danger of reification. St. Thomas uses nouns to speak of intellect and will and the estimative sense, etc., etc. And there's a risk of thinking that these are well-defined, almost solid things. If you've read the Beano or the Dante, you may have, or the Dandy, you may have come across the cartoon of the numbskulls. And in the numbskulls, this boy has a head with a brain department and an eye department and an ear department and so on. Little men inside doing the jobs. And there's a danger of thinking that the human psyche is basically an office block with a will department and an intellect department. And so I've had students ask me, how does the will know what to choose? Because it has its own intellect and will, each of which has its own intellect and will ad infinitum. The question to ask is, how do I know what to choose? To say that I have an intellect means I can think rationally. These are powers of soul, potentiae, capacities, possibilities that might be realized. They are dunamis in Aristotle's Greek. So my soul, my anima, my psyche, is my form of life. So of course, by definition, animals have souls. Each animal is an embodied form of life. There are plant souls, animal souls, human souls. Different forms of life, but they are all psyche within that meaning. And from the kind of soul you have, the kind of life you live, emerge a range of dunamis, possibilities that can be actualized either proactively, so that digestion is a proactive power to work on the food you've eaten, but many of our powers are passive or receptive, the ability to be attracted or to receive sense impressions. So we need to shift our thinking and be wary of our terminology. The human soul has more powers than any other. We are the most complex thing in the cosmos, both for Thomas and for modern science. And most of the powers of soul are powers of the embodied soul, or the ensouled body. Herbert McCabe, who used to lecture in this room, used to remark that Aristotle and St. Thomas had a low view of matter, but a high view of the body. The animal body is a remarkable thing, as is the human body. And all of what animals do is done by the living body, the ensouled, the animate body. Not all of what we do is done through a bodily organ. Intellect and will are powers of the soul alone. That would take a whole lecture course to unpack. So looking at the diagram, all living things have the vegetative faculties of taking in and assimilating nourishment, growing and reproducing. All animals have the sense of touch, and many have the other exterior senses of taste and sight and smell and hearing. That's straightforward. But the animals also have interior senses. That is to say, animals are able to organize and interpret their sense data. And there are 4 interior senses. The sensus communis is the coordinating power. My hand cannot determine that the hard thing I'm feeling is the brown thing I'm seeing. Neither can the eye determine that, but it's obvious to me because the sensus communis coordinates the data that comes through my hand and through my eye. And we can recall sense experience. That's the fantasia or imaginatio. We can retain sense impressions, and human beings at least can juggle them. Maybe animals do to some extent because dogs dream, but we certainly have a vivid imagination. Having seen gold and seen a mountain, we can imagine a golden mountain. That's the standard example. But animals also have an estimative power, vis estimativa. They can sense the meanings in their environment. So when it sees the wolf coming and hears the wolf growling, the sheep has a sense of danger. Not because the growling is grating on the ear, but because the sheep interprets its sense experience as dangerous. And a bird, as St. Thomas points out, can have a sense that this stick will be useful for building a nest. So animals can interpret their environment and get at the meanings in the environment. And that's because the vis estimativa brings together the coordinated sense data and something called the vis memorativa, a stock of meanings. So for Thomas, as a rule of thumb, the other animals have built-in instincts is part of the sheep's instinct, that when it sees the wolf, it has a sense of danger. We tend to learn. So we tend to learn the meanings in our environment rather than work by instinct. And so the vis memorativa in us can be called the vis cogitativa, the power to think at practical levels. It's the ratio particularis, the applied reason. I think we would want to say nowadays that Thomas's distinction is much more blurred. Animals can learn, perhaps more than he realised, and human beings have more instinct than he realised. But the basic point stands. Animals have built into them instincts, and animals, like the sheep, can acquire the knowledge that electric fence will mean pain, and we do the same kind of thing. And we do it with the brain. There's a bodily organ for the vis memorativa, the ratio particularis. So Thomas would not be at all surprised by animal consciousness, nor by what you might call, and he might call, animal intelligence. So, a lot of what happens in our psyche is what happens in the psyche of other animals. And the other animals are able to transcend matter. That's at the top of page 5 of the handout. Owing to bad time management, I have ceased to give the references. I shall put them in due course and put the handout on the website, and then you can download it if you are still interested. But the animals can abstract sense data from matter. The eye of any animal can see, so to speak, the brownness of this desk and hold it without having the matter of the desk stuffed into its head. There are big implications of that for what you might call the metaphysics of animals, which would be another strand of the research project. So each animal is a single organism with a single life, and as Herbert used to like to say, the seeing of an animal that is looking at something is an act of sense because it has meaning in the life of the whole animal. It's not just the biochemistry of the eye and the brain, but the whole animal is seeing. Indeed, the eye is only an eye in the true sense when it's actually functioning within the animal. It ceases to be an eye when it's plucked out. But human beings have higher powers. We have the ability to think rationally, to abstract from material conditions, to form universal concepts. So, abstract knowledge in the sense of episteme scientia is not the only human form of knowledge. The English word knowledge has to do duty to translate several words in Latin, like scientia and cognitio, or in French, savoir and connaître, or in German, wissen and kennen, and Polish does one better. It has 3 words, znać, umieć and wiedzieć. That's my showing off for the afternoon. So we grasp the world in various ways, and one way is by forming abstract concepts, by drawing out from what we observe universal concepts. So you go to the South American jungle and you observe a form of life that hasn't been seen before, and you form the concept of Conrad's pink-toed tarantula or something like that. I said you go, I wouldn't go and look for such things. So I have an intellect means I have the ability to draw out universal concepts from my sense experience and to retain and to organise them. And there's, of course, a huge amount more to say about that. And this intellectual activity is profoundly different from the sensory powers. It's something we share with the angels. Our ability to form abstract concepts abstracted from conditions of space and time furnishes St. Thomas's argument for for the subsistence, the immortality of the human soul. But of course, as in the diagram, the intellect works in close, organic cooperation with the imagination, with the ratio particularis, in both directions. So from our sense data we abstract concepts and then we apply them back. So veterinary scientists would abstract patterns of health and disease from their observations on animals, and then a vet, looking at a particular horse, will apply his knowledge to this specimen and diagnose fistulous withers, or whatever it is. And it's not easy, it's not a glib matter to put our finger on what it is that makes human beings different from animals. Thomas does not use anything neat like self-consciousness, but this ability to form abstract concepts, somehow to interpret our environment in a higher way than the other animals. And quite a few people have found it difficult to articulate very clearly exactly what is going on, despite the immense importance of this. One of Herbert's interests was how human language matches this, so to speak, structure of the psyche. My imagination grasped the sounds of words, so in different languages, cat, chat, felis and cot, so to speak, enflesh the same abstract concept which we use cat for. Of course, there are all sorts of subtleties that we have to discuss there. Somehow the open-endedness of human language, the way meaning is incarnate in sound or shape, mirrors this cooperation in the human psyche. St. Thomas accepts a kind of self-awareness of the intellect. The intellect knows that it is knowing. At the same time, we have to make a big effort to reflect on our acts of intellect. We are good at knowing things beneath us. We are not good at knowing ourselves. And the main reason why we know that human beings have an intellect is that we reflect on what human beings do. It's not by introspection into me that I know that I have an intellect. It's by a whole life of engagement with people who think, and I think in dialogue with them. So that's the perceptive side of the human psyche. We also have a reactive, a responsive side, where I've listed what I've called the emotions on the diagram. That's actually a bad translation. Emotions are really rather more subtle and complex, but the passiones animae are the kind of animal responses to the good or the harmful perceived by the senses. And there are 11 of those reactions in complex animals, not just in us. Some are kind of everyday, some are called up by challenging situations. I'm walking along the edge of a field with a thorn hedge beside me, and my dislike of being scratched keeps me going towards the gate. And the bull comes charging at me with its horns down, and I feel the emotion that I have listed on page 4 as hope. the emotion of hope is that energy that, because I perceive a way out of the danger, will arouse courage, so I force my way through the thorn hedge and escape. If, on the other hand, there's a 20-foot high wall with no finger holds, I feel despair rather than hope, which turns into fear as the ball approaches, and then I lash out in anger and punch it in the eye and escape that way.
Sorry.
And that's how the passiones animae work. So Thomas Nagel wrote a famous paper, What is it like to be a bat? And the answer is, I can't imagine. What is it like for a sheep to be afraid of the wolf? Well, we have the same experience ourselves. We have some idea what it's like for a cat to be hungry, or a sheep to be afraid, or an elephant to be bereaved. The same kind of thing happens in us as in the other animals. So we have these passiones animae, but we also have a will, a voluntas, the ability to be attracted by the good the intellect perceives. So Thomas has a high sense of the transcendence of the voluntas, and of its mysteriousness, but it's mysterious to us, not just to others. Only God can know my state of will. I can't, not by introspection. I cannot know by introspection whether I'm in a state of grace or not. I cannot know whether I love God above all things. I have to reflect on what I actually do. Do I keep on committing serious sins? Or do I say my prayers and obey God? The will, more than the intellect, is mysterious, but it's not this kind of self-conscious, proactive, deciding subject. It's this ability to be attracted, and it may surprise us what we turn out to want. We may have to make an effort to change our will. So there were surprising things in St. Thomas's account of the human psyche, and you will notice in that diagram that I've given you that there is no explicit consciousness or self-consciousness, no centre of consciousness, no scintilla animae. For consciousness is shifting and decentered. What we are conscious of varies. If I am conscious of some intense toothache, I cannot really be conscious of much else. And introspection, for Thomas, is neither automatic nor easy. So St. Thomas could be aligned, I think, with a lot of modern psychological discoveries. Within that context, we must say something about his view of personal decision-making. That's on page 6 of the handout. There is nothing in the psyche, as seen by St. Thomas, that corresponds to a centre of consciousness, a real me, a personhood, some proactive decision-making power of a very deliberate kind. there are those powers of intellect and will which have a lot of what is habitual and not immediately conscious. And in the interaction of thinking and loving, liberum arbitrium, free decision, will emerge. So thinking and desiring work together in decision-making for Aristotle and Aquinas. And intellect and will have their own inner dynamic. We have a kind of thrust towards truth and an attraction towards goodness. So I can't choose whether or not I want to be happy. It's intrinsic to the will that I desire to be happy. I might have the wrong idea about what makes me happy, but I can't help but want to be happy. There's an intrinsic dynamic to the will. But often we need to work out means to an end, and so liberum arbitrium, that decision-making, comes in when we have to, at various levels, decide how to achieve happiness. So freedom, or better, voluntariness, is more a matter, for Augustine and Aquinas, of responsible self-possession, so that we can put ourselves wholeheartedly into what is really good for us. It's freedom for excellence, as Pankers puts it, rather than freedom from constraints. So there'd be a huge amount that one could say about the real nature of real freedom. And we come into existence as a kind of blank slate. At least the intellect and the will are blank slates. We have to acquire knowledge through sensory input. And the will is attracted by the sense-perceived good as we react to the environment. So the passiones animae can in some sense attract the will. We are attracted by the good the intellect perceives. We are attracted by God. And it's only God, no other being, only God, that can act within the human will. And he does so not so much by pushing us, but as the final cause, the great good attracting us. So it belongs to the definition of the voluntary that it has an interior principle. If I were chained to this lectern, I would not be here voluntarily. Something exterior would hold me here, but from within, I remain here by my deliberate choice. So it is voluntary because it comes from an interior principle, but it doesn't have to be the first principle, not moved by something else. There is no thing inside me which is an unmoved first mover. I am not God. Only God is God. I am responsive. By my will, I am responsive, attracted by good, by God, and by a whole range of goods, mediated in various ways. So there is no proactive, unmoved first mover type of deciding thing within me. There is the ability to be attracted. And of course there are elements of spontaneity within me. I can choose to think this way or that way, and how I think will affect my will. There's a mysterious kind of spontaneity in me, but it's embedded. in a world that I'm part of through my body, and in a world of grace in a mysterious way, in the grace of God, somehow around and within me. All of which leaves open the big puzzle of evil. Why do we commit sin? And that's not fully explicable, because evil by its very nature is not explicable, because it's contrary to reason and truth and beauty. So this is something that needs to be significantly developed, I think, and people are developing it. But virtue is developed in an environment. We don't pop into being like that whale in The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. We are born in a biological and social context, with natural dynamics, with personal chemistry, so to speak, partly genetically determined, but also in a kind of divine context with an attraction to God, our archetype. And within all of that, we gradually, hopefully, build up a greater personal control as we deliberately develop or modify our habits. Or as Herbert would put it, we begin to tell our own life story. So decision-making emerges within a very complex and an embedded human psyche. Our transcendence, the kind of infinity that's there in intellect and will, does not mean there is a divine thing in us that is an unmoved first mover. It means we are open to the divine, that is God. So I think that's refreshing, and it leads on to the question I'm wanting to ask: where is the person that makes the decision? So top of page 7, I've mentioned a phrase that Thomas would agree with: acts are of persons. It's persons that act. It's not my hand that grasps the lectern, it is I that grasps the lectern. But what does Thomas mean by persona? I think we need very thoroughly to exorcise a kind of Cartesian picture of what persona is for anyone who lives before Descartes. To get a sense of what Aquinas means, or what the Church Fathers mean by the doctrine of the Holy Trinity, or what the Church Fathers mean by their Christology, we have to exorcise a Cartesian notion of the person. Rana suggested that it might happen that the Church forbids the use of the word person in Trinitarian language, because at the time that he wrote in the 1960s, person had all the wrong vibes, and if taken in a non-subtle way, could give you the completely wrong view of what the Trinity is. Since his time, people like Zizioulas have developed a relational understanding of person which is more helpful. But for St. Thomas, a persona is not a deciding component, a rational bit within human nature. Persona is, following Boethius, an individual substance of a rational nature. That is, it's a hypostasis, a single being. So a cat is a single being, but not a person, simply because feline nature is not rational. I am a hypostasis, a single being, and although the etymology is different, my persona is my hypostasis, the whole of me, and using that word persona is a marker that I have a rational nature. It's not the rational bit of my nature, it's the whole of me. And my persona includes more than my nature. It includes the colour of my hair and my eyes, and my ability to make personalised wedding cakes and so on. So within me, there is a human nature with intellect and will and all the rest that we looked at. They are parts of my nature, and hence parts of my person, but the person is the whole of me. So where is the person that makes the decision to give you this seminar paper? And here is not in here, or in here in the Hebrew anthropology where the heart is the source of decisions. The person that's deciding to stay here is here, this whole thing standing in front of you. Of course, I'm a metaphysical whole. That's another strand of research. There is more to me than biochemical analysis could ever grasp. My intellect and will are not acts of bodily organs. There is no thing you could point to in me which is the real seat of the intellect. Imagination is going on in here, and thinking is going on in cooperation with that. But there is no bodily organ that holds the concepts. There's a transcendence to me. But what is standing in front of you is the whole person. My seeing you is an act of the whole of me, though it uses my eyes and my brain. And my deciding to stay here is an act of the whole of me, employing intellect and will and other powers, but it's an act of me. So we need to have an ontological view of the person, freeing us to recognise the complexity and the components, so to speak, of the human psyche. And I would still be a human person even if for some reason I could not use my intellect. If I were blind drunk, if that were whiskey rather than apple juice, I'd cease to be able to think rationally. I wouldn't cease to be a person. If I fell asleep rather than putting you to sleep, I would still be a person. If some huge spider fell from the ceiling, I would not be able to think. I would react by the irascible emotions, either in terms of fight or flight. I don't like killing them, so I probably flee rather than squash it. But even if I can't think rationally, I'm still a person. But then very briefly, where is the real me? That's a slightly different question. Am I putting up a mask to hide the real me from you? Would it improve our relationships if I took down the mask? Well, some people can and do deceive others. Typically, we try to be honest. St. Thomas has lots of interesting data. Sometimes it seems that what's interior is most important. The degree of charity forming my will determines my standing before God. how much do I love God? But in some ways, what we actually do or don't do is the authentic expression of what we really want. So, if someone has committed a serious sin and says, oh, I'm going to go to confession and get absolved, so my desire for the sacrament is already laying hold on God's forgiveness. But then that person doesn't go to confession week after week, after month after month. Then he didn't have the will to go to confession. He had a velleitas, a vague wish. He hasn't laid hold on the grace of the sacrament. We might have a character we aren't happy with. We might need for some time to act out of character in order to pursue a virtue-building policy to become what we would like to be. And surely what we would like to be is more authentic than what we don't like about ourselves. We might have to resist certain drives and instincts that are in some ways part of us in order to put forward a deliberate chosen policy. So if I were to exhibit the real me in one sense, I would not have given this paper. I would have looked at funny cats on YouTube all afternoon, or looked on eBay to use my holiday money to collect the sets of the Baco building material I never had when I was a child, because they changed the style, and I would spend the afternoon building some great mansion or making a huge Battenberg cake. But my deliberate policy of promoting St. Thomas has me suppressing all of that and standing here in front of you. We might make an act of conscience, a deliberate choice to do X or Y, and then we don't do it through fear or laziness. And that, St. Thomas would say, is culpable. So all sorts of things in us might be important in various ways for deciding who might safely marry someone else because they're compatible and so on and so forth. But in a sense, what counts as the real me is incarnate in my concretely chosen, put forward important acts and decisions. My choice to stand here in front of you is more the real me than the various interests and desires that I might otherwise indulge instead of doing this. So in a sense, persona, prosopon in Greek, is this whole being. In another compatible way, my persona, my prosopon, is the mask I put forward. That's what prosopon traditionally meant. What I put forward by my deliberate acts is where I express my decisions towards what I want to be and what I want to do for you and what I want to do for God. Of course, many things that we do are not deliberately chosen, like scratching our head without realising it. So St. Thomas gives us a sense of the complexity of the human psyche, which is compatible with the transcendence of elements in the psyche, our dignity and our vocation. He has a holistic view of the human being, but he points us to an ontology where the whole organism of the animal or the human being has existence as a whole, an existence given and sustained by God. And it's the whole of me that is the acting person. the acting person is not a homunculus inside me, but it is me, using all that's in my psyche freely to choose to do what I actually do. So, where is the person that makes the decision standing here in front of you? So that's my time more than used up, and now you can shoot down everything I have said.